Hello, my friends. This is Al Spectra, and welcome back to the Land of Empires. And today, I would like to bring everyone part 2 of my technical guides on the Land of Empire mechanics. And with T12 troops likely right around the corner, I would like to introduce everyone to the Land of Empire's combat mechanics, in particular, the damage formula. So, if anyone ever went into the battle engine, meaning that if you were to click the play button on the reports. So the play button, I won't be showing you here, but it is present on the top right of the report. Now, the play button actually will not show up if the battle took place outside of the server you are in. So for example, if the battle took place in the Lost Shrine, which happens every other Sunday, then you will not be able to see that battle replay if you teleport outside of the Lost Shrine. So similarly, in server versus server and cross-server content such as the Battle of Disorder and Battle of Destiny, you will only be able to view those reports within those areas. So if you teleport out of the Battle of Destiny, you will no longer see that play button. That play button will not reappear until you teleport back into the Battle of Destiny. And so this also applies to server versus server. If that battle occurred on the enemy server, you will only be able to review that battle when you are present in the enemy server. I don't know why things are like that, but that's how it is. Now, I want to separate this introduction to the battle formula into the battle formula in a couple parts. So the first part, I want to talk about the stats themselves. So the attack stats, ferocity stats, defense stats, and HP stats, as well as what they do. The second part, I want to focus on the unit tier. As everyone knows, there are currently 11 tiers, and with T12 coming up, it will be very interesting to see how much stronger T12s will be compared to T11. And then after that, I will go into the glorious tiers. So as everyone knows, sands are very important for leveling up your glorious tier, and people with lower glorious tier are typically very afraid of people with higher glorious tier. And in this mechanics, I will show why they are sometimes rightly afraid. Of course, that is assuming they are outside of the Battle of Disorder. If you are in the Battle of Disorder, glorious tiers and a lot of other stats, they don't really have much of an impact. So if you are afraid of a glorious 10, then you are losing out on your on the capable damage that you are able to deal to them. And finally, I will go into a bit more of a complicated portion of the damage formula, and that is the unit count. And this might surprise a couple of people. It might surprise most people, but the combat damage is actually restricted by your opponent's total forces. And I'll go into more detail about that in the end. So let's start with the basic stats. As everyone knows, there are 4 types of basic stats. There's the attack, the ferocity, and so these are the offensive stats. And then there's the defense and HP. So these are the defensive stats. Now, early on in the Land of Empires, a lot of people thought that ferocity percent actually had things to do with how quickly your troops attacked. And in the battle animation, so when you look at the replay, all troops will attack seemingly at the same time, no matter how high or low the ferocity percent is. And now I'm here to tell you that ferocity is actually just like attack. It works the same way as attack percent. So how do these two stats work together? They are actually multipliers towards each other. So they are actually exchangeable. You can pretend ferocity is attack and attack is ferocity. There is no clear difference. The only difference is the percentage, meaning that if your ferocity is really low, for example, sitting at maybe 500%, and your attack is 1000%, for example, an equal increase in ferocity would give you more output than an equal increase in attack percent. So this is just the nature of two numbers being multiplied together. If you multiply 3 plus 3, and you'll get 9. And if I add 6 to one of them, for example, now you have 6 multiplied by 3, you'll get 18. So if instead I balance the two, so now instead of 9 multiplied by 3, I have 6 multiplied by 6. I will have 36 instead of 18. And the really takeaway from that is that you want to balance attack and ferocity. So if attack is much higher than ferocity percent, for example, then additional attack percent will give you lower output than the same amount of ferocity percent. Same amount of extra ferocity percent, I should say. So if you have 1,300% attack plus total attack, and you have 1,100% ferocity and total ferocity percent, then you would want to work more on ferocity and total ferocity percent. And I hope this also answers the question of what talent one wants to use. I know a lot of people are wondering about whether they should boost their ferocity talent or attack talent. And the answer to that is you want to boost whatever total percent is the lowest. So ferocity percent plus total ferocity percent versus attack percent plus total attack percent. Now, some of you might notice that I have 100 here. And this is because at the very beginning, everyone's stats start at, well, it's technically just a 1 multiplier. If you add 10% attack to this 1 multiplier, you have a 1.1 multiplier. So if someone has 1,000% attack plus total attack, for example, and 1,000% ferocity plus total ferocity, their final output will be 11 times 11, which is 121. So you will have a 12.1 fold multiplier against your enemy. Meaning that originally, if you were doing 1 damage, now you will do 12.1 damage. And now we come to the defensive part. And the defensive part is really just attack divided by defense. So defense and HP, and the reason why I have an E here is just representing the enemy stats. So the final damage done is a multiplier of your attack and your ferocity divided by your enemy's defense multiplied by their HP. And so as similar to how attack and ferocity are interchangeable, HP and defense are also interchangeable. So HP is really the same as defense, vice versa. Meaning the same concept applies. If your HP is lower than your defense, you would want to work on your HP. If your defense is lower than your HP, you would want to boost your defense either through Lord Medals or Hero Stars, etc. I won't go too much into what kind of general buffs boost each type of stats. I think many veteran players would be well aware of that. But just to give a quick summary, relics are typically there to boost ferocity and HP. Same with Lord Gems, while Lord Medals will boost attack and defense, as well as hero stats. Interestingly, early game, a lot of stats will focus on attack and defense. However, I wouldn't really say the late game, but rather for whales, especially those who raise their metal and relics, gems and relics, they will actually have more ferocity and HP rather than attack and defense. So for those people, I would actually focus my talents on attack and defense rather than ferocity and HP, because I would be getting more value out of those. So next, I will move on to troop tiers. And these numbers represent the multiplier, the power multiplier, or I should say the damage dealt multiplier from the previous troop tier. So to put it in plain words, tier 2 troops, the same number of tier 2 troops, will deal 1.5 times more damage than tier 1 troops. Tier 3 troops will deal 1.4 times more damage than tier 2 troops. Tier 4 troops will deal 1.3 times more damage than tier 3 troops. And conversely, they will also take 1.3 times less damage than tier 3. So tier 5 troops will deal 1.2 times and take 1.2 times less damage than tier 4. So these tiers are really impactful in the early game. And what is really important here, what you should really notice, is the difference between, I should say, the gap from T9 to tier 10. Between tier 9 and tier 9.5, the troops actually gain 1.61 times the damage potential than tier 9. And they also take 1.61 times less damage. And this has been tested by multiple people. So the difference between a tier 9.5 troops and a tier 9 troop is actually very big, very, very big. And similarly, a tier 10 troops compared to a tier 9 troops is significantly more powerful. They can deal 1.38 times more damage and take 1.38 times less damage. And the difference between tier 10 and tier 11, which is what most people are probably interested in, is 1.25. So tier 11 troops deal 1.25 times more damage than tier 10, and they take 1.25 times less damage. So overall, this would be evaluated at about a 52% improvement. Just some guessing. I would guess it's overall 52% better than tier 10. So it will be very interesting to see what the improvement tier 12 troops would bring. If it is higher than 1.25, then that would be quite pay to win. If it is lower than 1.25, then lower players should be happy about that because they will not be completely dominated by just a simple poke of a big pay to win player. And the one takeaway from that for early game players is really to rush tier 9.5. And of course, also tier 10. You do not want to stay at tier 9, just seeing the degree of the gap between tier 9.5 and tier 9. So next, I want to talk about glorious tiers. So each glorious tier, not only do you get stats, but you also get an intrinsic boost from the glorious troops. Now, everyone already know about how stats work now. I hope they do. So let's just ignore the stats. They will give you an inherent degree of power based on these multiplier ratios. As for the glorious levels themselves, they give a 1.1 multiplier between glorious 1 to glorious 5 per glorious level, and a 1.15 multiplier from glorious 6 to glorious 10. So if your troops are glorious 1, for example, and you're fighting glorious 2 troops, assuming everything else is equal, then your enemy would be able to deal 1.1 times more damage to you while taking 1.1 times less damage from you. And this is really the impact of glorious tiers and why glorious tiers are so important and why people rushing glorious tier, for example, those who rush glorious 8 to glorious 10 instead of pushing for T11, has a good reason on their hands, because simply 2 glorious levels from glorious 6 to glorious 10 is already a huge improvement over having T11. Not only do you have glorious for all your troops, but the multiplier itself would be 1.15 times 1.15, which is almost better than 1.25. It is better than 1.25, right? Can PowerPoint do math? I don't think so. That's 1.10 to the power of 5. So a glorious 5 will technically have, well, assuming all stats are the same, of course they won't be the same because you gain inherent stats between each glorious level. But let's assume all stats are the same. Then your units will deal 1.61 times more damage while taking 1.61 times less damage than your opponent. Now, the difference between glorious 5 and glorious 10 is even bigger. So now we have, instead of 1.1 exponential per glorious tier, you have 1.15. So now a glorious 10 will inherently deal twice the damage and take 2 times less damage than a glorious 5. So although the costs increase after each glorious tier, the power that you gain from them actually makes it rather linear, or I should say you gain more power between later glorious tiers than early glorious tiers, because this is plotted based on attack or defense only. But if we combine attack and defense, meaning that not only do we take into account the extra damage you deal, but also take into account the less damage that you take, then this will actually curve up, meaning that you get more power at later glorious tiers per cost than at earlier glorious tiers. So it's the takeaway from this is that it is really cost efficient in terms of the power gain to invest into the glorious tier rather than investing in something like T11 or basic stats. The denominator here is just the enemy stats. So if the enemy is higher glorious than you, then you just factor in the difference. And finally, I want to talk about how the unit count plays into the combat mechanics. I should say the damage dealt and the damage taken. So as everyone knows, there are 3 unit types. There's the infantry, the cavalry, and the archer. And each unit type, the damage that they deal is relative to the square root of the unit count. So if you have 10,000 infantry, for example, and your infantry deals 10 damage, now you have 40,000 infantry. Your infantry, simply based on this part of the equation, your infantry will deal 20 damage. However, in reality, the infantry does not deal 20 damage. It deals 40 damage instead. Now, you might think that it is because you quadrupled your unit from 10,000 to 40,000, and therefore you're dealing 4 times the damage. Although that makes sense, it is actually separated into 2 components. There is the unit count, the square root of the unit count, and then there's the square root of the total army count. And the total army count is restricted by either your army or your opponent's army, whichever army is bigger. So if your opponent, let's just assume for now in a simplistic case that your opponent has unlimited army. So if you increase your infantry from 10,000 to 40,000, your damage will increase by the square root of the increase in your infantry multiplied by the square root of the increase in your army. So you increase by 4-fold. The square root of 4 is 2. And your total army increases by 4-fold. So the square root of 4, once again, is 2. 2 times 2 is 4. So your damage increases by 4-fold. Now, if your opponent only has 10,000 troops, interestingly, the total army count becomes restricted. The maximum of the total army count factored into this equation is the maximum between your army count or the enemy's army count multiplied by some constant. And that constant is around 0.95, but I have not been able to get anyone to test this. Lazy butts. Anyways, let's just assume this is 1 for now. This will make things a little bit simple. So let's assume this is 1. And this means that if your opponent has 10,000 total army, and you increase your infantry from 10,000 to 40,000, then what happens is that your damage will not increase by 4. It will only increase by 2. Because this part of the equation will stay constant. It will stay at 10,000 because the maximum army size, I mean the minimum army size. I don't know why I was saying max, I take that back. But it takes into account the minimum army size between the 2 sides. So if your opponent has fewer army than you do, then this part of the equation will be based on your opponent's army size rather than yours. So back to what I was saying, if your opponent has 10,000 army and you increase your infantry from 10,000 to 40,000, then your damage will only go up by 2-fold because this part of the equation will stay at 10,000. So it will not change. So you will have 4, square root of 4 equals 2. 2 times 1 equals 2. So your total damage will multiply by 2. And why this part of the equation is very important is during Season 6 PvP, to give an example, you do not want to lose other unit types too much. For example, if you have 10,000 infantry and you have 40,000 cavalry and your enemy is running 100,000 troops, your 40,000 cavalry will help the damage of your infantry. So to run some numbers, for example, if you have 10,000 infantry, you do 10 damage. Now you add in 30,000 cavalry. Now suddenly you have 40,000 total troops instead of 10,000 total troops. So although your infantry count did not change, the damage that they deal will actually double because this part of the equation quadrupled, and the square root of 4 equals 2, and 2 times 1 is 2. So now your infantry deals twice the amount of damage, but that is only on the condition that the cavalry stays alive. If the cavalry dies very quickly, then suddenly your total army count will go to shit. And then you'll be left with very few infantry who will have their damage significantly reduced and restricted to only this part of the equation. So the first emphasis I want to make is when you guys are doing PvP, you do not want to put a unit that loses troop very quickly, unless that unit is critical to hurting some component of the enemy's composition. So for example, if the enemy is running a lot of archers and you do not think your infantry can kill those archers in one hit, this is outside of arena, more like in open field PvP. So for example, they have a total defensive force of 1.5 million and they have 500,000 archer. You might consider running a one cavalry, one archer infantry composition. And you might realize that your season 6 99% infantry composition cannot one-shot their archer. So what you would do is run a lot of cavalry, and the cavalry is used to wipe out their archer. Now, the reason why you don't want to do that in arena is because cavalry dies much faster than infantry. And as the cavalry dies, or I should say as the cavalry loses a lot of units, your total damage potential will go way down due to this part of the equation. And the second emphasis I want to make is in open field HQ hitting. So when you are about to attack an enemy HQ, the enemy will have a lot of defensive troops. For example, they may have 3 million. And the reason why they cannot do much damage to you is because of this part of the equation. So you can really thank this part of the equation for being able to burn a lot of players, a lot of weaker players, without much consequence. Because otherwise, if it wasn't for, I should say it's more due to this part of the equation. If it wasn't for this part of the equation and it was simply based on the maximum army size between you or the opponent, then you would kind of get wrecked because your opponent's total damage would scale based on the total defensive army, which is like 3 million. Then it will go from an total army size of like 200,000, which is what people typically run, or 225,000, whatever, to 10 times that, or even 20 times that. And suddenly their damage is multiplied by like 4 or 5. And that's really bad for you. Of course, assuming that they are running Season 6 defense. Otherwise, they're just dumb. So you can thank this part of the equation for being able to deal massive damage to vulnerable enemy players, because no matter how big your army is, and this is also a warning towards people trying to defend against solo hitters, because no matter how big your army is, you will be restricted by this part of the equation. Your units will only be able to depend on this part of the equation. So you are essentially losing over half your damage potential depending on how much this part of the equation would have otherwise weighted. If you have like 100 million army, then literally your 100 million army, like 30 million infantry or whatever, it will only be able to rely on this part. And this part will just be 200,000. It would be no more than 200,000 unless your enemy rallies with a 1 million army. So yeah, I'm getting a little bit sidetracked. But I hope this was a helpful explanation of how part of the damage formula in the Land of Empire works. There are many other components of the damage formula that people or I have not figured out. One of which is how formation stats % work. So if anyone can figure out how formation stats % play into this formula, that would be very helpful. Also, how troop counter stats % work I mean, not stats percent, but rather, the Land of Empires recently implemented a system where certain troop type counter other types. We currently have no idea how impactful that is. It doesn't seem to be impactful, but it will be very good to know really the hard numbers around that. And finally, I just wanted to throw in a little bit of tidbit for the extra stats associated with the Glorious tiers. As some of you might have seen, at between Glorious 3 and Glorious, I should say between Glorious 2 and Glorious 3, and between Glorious 7 and Glorious 8, you get like what, 10% or 20% extra stats, extra HP for the infantry, for example. And I believe those are just additive stats towards this HP percent. So don't really pay attention to that. There's nothing really special there's nothing really special about Glorious 8 or Glorious 3. It is just something that we thought at one point. And this is really why knowing the exact or approximately exact equation is so important, because we're able to really figure out what is impactful and what is not, and help us understand the remaining parts of the equation. Because without this starting point, everything's very hard to figure out. So I hope everyone enjoyed this guide, and I will see everyone in my next video. Take care.